Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you to all of you who helped get me here. I'm most grateful to be here. A little astounded to be introduced as the preeminent pre-colonial scholar. Partly because when I came to write the introduction with my co-editors to the Cambridge history, this was in 2009 or something like that, one of the things that distressed me the most was to grapple with the extent to which the field, the study of pre-colonial Southern Africa, had advanced so very little, I thought, since when I'd done my own original work. And I had sort of left behind to get on with the business of the constitution of knowledge, how the things that got labelled as the sources and so on had been constructed. And I'd somewhat moved my focus away from actually trying to be the historian to thinking about all these processes of knowledge production. So tonight's lecture is very much a late career return to these questions and a need, I think, to wrestle with the legacy of a particular notion of oral tradition. So, here goes. So first a little bit of background. From about 1898, the colonial official and prolific recorder of historical materials, James Stewart, sought out people, particularly elderly African men, with a knowledge of the history of the African societies of Natal and surrounding regions. So he recorded his conversations with them in some detail, and this was in a gradually growing collection of notes. The notes are meticulously dated, and Stewart was very careful to note the names of everyone that he spoke to. He pursued his researches until his departure from Natal in about 1920, ultimately amassing notes of conversations with some 200 interlocutors. He died in 1942 in London, and in 1949 his widow sold his notes to that notable collector of Afrikaner, Kelly Campbell. And now they are in the University of KwaZulu-Natal in the Kelly Campbell Afrikaner collection. Now, the decolonization of much of Africa in the 1950s and 60s, as I think is all too well known to my hosts tonight, generated active interest in the African past before European colonialism. And this, of course, and you know this well, stimulated academic inquiry into the use of oral sources. So, Jan van Siener's Oral Tradition, a study in historical methodology, first published in French in 1961 and then in English in 1965, was the seminal publication and rapidly became something, I suppose, of a methodological handbook for this new generation of historians of the long African past. It established the existence of oral traditions as potential sources for the distant past and offered tools for their analysis. Inspired by this, a generation of Southern African historians undertook intensive field work. They interviewed people, recorded oral traditions, and they also turned to collections of recorded materials like the Stewart collection. Interest in the Stewart collection then inspired Colin Webb, then a historian at the University of Natal, to arrange for the publication of the papers, and he and John Wright have worked on these since the 1970s. There are now 6 volumes, and a 7th one in the making. So the progressive publication of these volumes was an extraordinary boon to scholars who were interested in the region before European colonialism. So the notes are readily available, they're easily readable in TypeScript, they've been organized according to interlocutors, sections that were originally in Zulu have been translated into English, and the notes augmented with extensive scholarly annotation. And they've got wonderful, meticulous indexes. So the result of this has really enabled very efficient entry into and ready mining of the notes. And the volumes are heavily cited by scholars working on almost any aspect of the history of the region before 1920, and particularly the earlier eras before the Anglo-Zulu War. I use the word mining quite deliberately here to draw attention to something that astonishes me. The persistence to this day of an approach that extracts nuggets of fact from such records, finding corroboration in the occurrence of such nuggets across sources. Perhaps the clearest indication of this is that when a nugget reveals something, the relevant footnote is to a page reference in the published volumes, without even the name of the person to whom Stewart was conversing. In some cases, pure extraction is modified by the use of something from that Vancina toolkit, or maybe David Henniger's chronology concerns, telescoping, lengthening, and so on, clarifying this little nugget. This kind of raiding of recorded text for facts, often by reputable scholars whose work I, in many ways, deeply appreciate, happens in the face of extensive work by a variety of other scholars, mostly located outside the discipline of history. Some of this work is long-standing work, work using ideas and concepts in performance studies and literary analysis, drawing on Ruth Finnegan, Karen Barber, and others. Dates back to the 1980s, a lot of it. In South Africa, the work of Isabel Hofmeyr is perhaps the best known. The extraction of nuggets also happens in the face of a by now substantial, really substantial body of scholarship on Stewart's aims, his working methods, his assumptions, his agendas, and how these shifted over time. In 1987, Julian Cobbing, in one of the propositions of the Mfecane debate, described the Stewart collection as a tainted well, an exercise in colonial fantasy. His characterization has been substantially debated. Papers and papers published on this. How any one scholar comes down in this debate affects how you might use the Stewart notes. The extraction of nugget further happens in the face of now another significant body of work done on Stewart's interlocutors, on who they were, what experiences and inheritances shaped their accounts, how and why they came to be in conversation with Stewart. And where mining of the text is eschewed in favor of some background discussion of the recorder and his interlocutors, it's all too often cursory, treating the text narrowly as either fictions or accurate renditions of well-known clan traditions. Indeed, the most recent monograph in the field that I work in by Elizabeth Eldridge on the creation of the Zulu kingdom proposes that the interpretive stakes are about whether oral traditions are invented or not. The problem I want to suggest tonight turns rather on the concept of oral traditions itself. I'm going to take a while to get there, but I'm going to hope you'll bear with me. So already in 1989, David Cohen sought to undefine oral tradition, arguing that oral tradition has been privileged as some kind of specific, distinctive cultural form and process within African society, past and present. Cohen's is a powerful essay that has been surprisingly little taken up by African historians, in part perhaps because it was published in the journal Ethnohistory rather than in the area studies journals, perhaps also in part because of the way in which it directly challenged a whole field of expertise centered on oral traditions, dominated by Vancina and Henniger, and reproduced through the field's own bespoke journal, History in Africa. I'm not going to try to reprise the Cohen paper here, but I do want to draw out some main points. His centering of the full complexity of the ways in which knowledge of the past is deeply engaged in fixed social process. And I understand that I'm talking to numbers of anthropologists. There's hardly a surprise there. His drawing out of the very many ways in which expert knowledge of the past is continuously assembled and reassembled in numerous settings, rather than lodged in a distinctive text or series of texts definable as oral tradition. In the essay, Cohen invites scholars to rework their logic of the production of historical knowledge. To think about the logic of the production of historical knowledge in relation to the notes recorded by Stewart, and to do so with the purpose of illuminating the pre-colonial past, is, I think, to do things that go well beyond considering the biases and interests of Stewart and his interlocutors and the circumstances of the conversation and note-taking. Temporally, the logics concerned are not simply those of colonizer and colonized at the moment of encounter. If thinking about the logic of the production of historical knowledge is not confined to these things, as important as they undoubtedly are, then what? And here I turn my attention to a word and a concept that is not much in evidence in studies of the long history of the Southern African past, certainly not the so-called pre-colonial past. The concept of discourse, and more specifically the matter of political discourse in relation to that long past before colonialism, and more specifically in a situation where there are no contemporary written sources. Now, for a historian, chronology is of the essence. To carry on with this lecture, the historian in me and my commitment to chronology suggests I must begin at a starting point at some kind and work my way forward in time. But I've already suggested that temporal questions involved in thinking about the logic of the production of historical knowledge about the past before European colonialism are not simple. I'm going to have to come back to this in a minute. So bear with me while I jump into a particular historical moment, from there tracking forwards and then backwards in time. I want you to bear with me while I remind us of something of the way in which the pre-colonial past was taken up in political practices and academic developments that followed that happened during colonialism and followed afterwards. So I'm going to plunge us into the 1840s in colonial Natal. So Theophilus Shepstone had recently appointed as a diplomatic agent for the native tribes in the fledgling colonial administration, must find a way of ruling and administering the inhabitants of the region at little cost and with scant manpower. Now, elsewhere, I've argued at some length that Shepstone did this by actively appropriating to his administration aspects of indigenous ideas about sovereignty, power, authority, and by developing the ability to embody them to a certain degree in speech and performance. It was central to my argument that Shepstone understood that ongoing and active discussions about the nature of the rule, in particular of Shaka, the first Zulu king, understood all that to be a form of political discourse, a discourse that he sought to tap into. So it was a feature of his administration that it took on board many African aspects, but he understood them as features of political praxis, and hence by definition as dynamic. And during the early years of his tenure, he operated with them in a dynamic fashion. Amongst other more obvious features like chiefship, Shepstone upheld the institutions of polygamy and lobola, which he recognized as fundamental to homestead production. Now, of course, these appropriations cannot be understood as the importation into the colonial system of indigenous practices and discourse in an intact fashion. Shepstone intervened and shaped them to suit his purpose in a plausible manner. The colony grew and settler demands for land and labor became rapacious. The native administration was obliged to seek forms of compromise between settler needs and the needs of the colony's African inhabitants. In the process, they began to turn aspects of ongoing political discourse and practice into a codified system of rules and procedures with historical backing. That's the important point. There's now a large body of work that really takes us into how the political praxis and the ideas that Shepstone mobilized get fixed into tribe and tribe attached to a particular parcel of land. Shepstone produced 2 historical documents backed with definitive maps. The first, an account of the rise of Zulu power, which he used to justify his mode of government, and the second, the histories of 94 Natal tribes, quote, written down from the lips of the narrators and as near as possible in their words to counter settler arguments that the Africans were not Aboriginal. The report that he produced was not responsible for the establishment of tribal trust, but it did lay out the historical basis for firmly circumscribed tribal identities, for a connection between them and equally circumscribed parcels of land. In the process, creating an early template for how oral historical materials would be marshalled to support land and chief claims for the next 150 years. What emerged then in the colony of Natal was a system of so-called native administration which recognized fairly fixed forms of chiefly authority, and colonial magistrates carried out their business in a manner informed variously to greater and less extents, on ideas rooted in indigenous practices, drawing on tribal histories, as well as on fixed and codified custom. And of course, while all this is going on, as you can imagine, the missionaries in Natal were also active in defining a range of ideas that they encountered, grappling with African understandings of the world and seeking to find and counter indigenous theology. They identified what they conceptualized as indigenous beliefs about human origins and creation, as well as about ancestors, and designated these as heathen religious ideas. And in this way, such ideas became distinguished from the body of materials that Shepstone and other officials identified as either political discourse or historical evidence. Move that stuff out of the picture. The middle decades of the 19th century, I think, are interesting and revealing for the way in which, in experimental and in sometimes very contradictory ways, indigenous political discourse was both mobilized and constrained in various settings. None of this happened by grand design, nor was it necessarily coherent. These were contingent processes shaped by contestation, opportunism, error, and much more in the maw of colonial politics. And they were also processes in which local Africans participated equally contingently, opportunistically, and strategically. Nowhere do we see this more clearly than in the exploratory interventions and writings of an early cohort of Christians clustered around the radical Bishop of Natal, John Colenso. Local Africans, men like William Ngidi, who sought to navigate a rapidly changing world. So, by the time James Stewart, let's get a picture of him up. By the time James Stewart, who much admired Shepstone, joined the colonial service in the 1880s, he was both to share Shepstone's commitment to administering in this manner deeply cognizant of African ways of doing things, and was intent on having historical evidence to support and guide administrative decisions made by others, less steeped in that logic, discourse, and history. Precisely what Stewart envisaged he would produce from his notes is, to my mind, not clear. In 1902, he jotted down the following note: "My object is to collect native custom so universally and thoroughly as to become an authority on it, and compare that with existing legislation. All will then be bound to come to my well, or contaminated well, as Cobbing would have it, to drink." While he achieved a certain amount of recognition as an authority on native custom in his career in Natal, this did not ever translate into a definitive work. So we have the raw notes and a few rough manuscripts. Now, I'm tempted to argue that this failure to produce a definitive work was because the assembled collection of notes was so extensive, so discursive in nature, so revealing of the ways in which knowledge of the past is deeply engaged in fixed social process, so clearly evidence not of facts, but of expert knowledge of the past, continuously assembled in numerous settings, to use Cohen's terms, that an authoritative account of native law and custom was, for Stewart at least, manifestly impossible. Stewart might have wanted to be an expert, but his Shepstonian leaning disposed him to be sensitive to the discursive. He took intense pride in his immersion in and familiarity with African discourse. He was a fluent Zulu linguist and an accomplished performer of praise poetry, and his notes are peppered with pleased asides about how surprised his interlocutors are by the depth of his knowledge of the most esoteric of matters. If we can see Stewart as deeply engaged in both African and colonial discourse and practice, what of the people with whom Stewart was conversing? The first thing to do would be to note the range of conversation partners. 185 or more interlocutors, loyalists, colonial loyalists, rebels, mission converts, chiefs, commoners, a sprinkling of women, a handful of Europeans. By the 1890s, and there really is a lot of research to show us this now, these interlocutors were alert to the ways in which historical information was taken up in the course of native administration. In certain cases, they and their political principals, often their chiefs, appear to have sought to use the opportunity afforded by Stewart researchers to get their versions of the past on record. There were expectations on both sides of the Stewart conversations, which shaped how historical material was presented, elicited, and recorded. both sides clearly understood its political heft. It's further clear that the expectations on all sides were in flux. For one thing, all the parties involved were listening to and influencing one another. You can see it if you follow the conversations across a few hundred pages of notes. So, in Ndlovu Gatimuni, whose text I've put up a sheet of, was a chief of a section of the Royal Zulu House and was interviewed by Stewart first in late 1902, again in 1903. In 1904, Stewart interviewed Mseni Gamuzi, an important Kwabe chief. By 1906, both Ndlovu and Mseni were major leaders in the Maphumulo uprising, known as the Bambata Rebellion. What Jeff Guy's account of the uprising shows us is the political skills of both of these men in navigating colonial politics and the political world of what at the time was called tribal affairs. In relation to both, the documentary record of their words is substantial, found in both Stewart's notes and in the transcript of the court proceedings which followed the rebellion. Interestingly, no one has brought the two together. Moreover, their political praxis was closely interlaced with that of mission-trained intellectuals like John Dube, who was publishing novels about the reign of Shaka in isiZulu, soliciting historical contributions for his historical language newspaper Ilanga Lase Natale, and working tirelessly at this time to bring chiefs and Christians together in a political association capable of engaging the colonial administration. As is well known, it was this confluence that drove the rise of Zulu nationalism over the next few decades. Then, and I'm going to have to go a little bit faster because we've got a lot of ground to cover just to think about what's happening to political discourse. Union in 1910, the Natal Native Administration was folded into a Union Native Affairs Department. And while the Natal's model of tribal administration was influential, the kind of concerns that animated Shepstone and Stewart tuned them into local discourse and practices fell away. There's a long story to be told here. In many rural settings in the new Union, Africans who were not farm labourers were administered on a tribal basis through the institution of chiefs. By the 1920s, this sector of the population had begun to attract intensive academic attention and were the focus of a newly constituted field, reflected in the first journal dedicated to anthropology and African languages in South Africa, the journal Bantu Studies. Linguistic and early anthropological concerns placed an emphasis on population migrations, and this paradigm is nowhere more evident than in the weighty work of A.T. Bryant, a missionary turned Bantu Studies lecturer. Working across much the same time as Stewart, talking to many of the same people, Bryant produced in 1929 a large piece of work that shaped the understanding of the pre-colonial history of the region, based on oral evidence dealing with the pre-colonial period. In contrast to Stewart's notes, it took a form translated into the embryonic discourse of the emerging Bantu studies field, tinged with some rather embellished folklorist flourishes. This new field of academic inquiry gained particular inflections then in the face of persistent settler arguments and later Afrikaner nationalist ones, which wanted to argue, as you know well, that South Africa was an empty land into which the first Bantu migrated at the same time as the Europeans landed at the Cape. In the early days, two streams of anthropology contributed to this project, social anthropology and Volkekunde. Following Malinowski in locating appropriately sequestered tribal societies, the early anthropological studies effectively sidelined political relations with government, treating their target communities as societies in themselves rather than components of the wider political system. Many followed Radcliffe Brown's structural functionalist approach, viewing such societies as well-defined entities that sought to maintain equilibrium and social order based on those general concepts, kinship, social system, and so on. I make this point about sequestered societies, quite aware, of course, of the way in which the work of someone like Isaac Shapiro in the 1930s included the activity of colonial officials, that many of these same anthropologists turned their history later to urban anthropology and the migrant labor system. I don't think these latter points cancel out the former one. The reality is that the search for the most tribal happened alongside recognition of increasingly rapid change. But the point that I want to draw attention to is that the overall effect of the early social anthropology work was to keep the focus firmly on matters social and cultural at the expense of the political, and more specifically at the expense of the way in which the tribal system was an integral part of the segregationist and later the apartheid state. It was really only, I suppose, in the 1950s with the work of Lloyd Fallows on Bantu bureaucracy, influenced by Weber, which began to examine the kind of political questions that I'm talking about. So the net result was that early social anthropology, working through a framework that examined kinship, ritual, and belief and worldview, seen in cultural terms, would recognize social change, but again, moving to the side, away from political discourse. The Volkerkunde ethnological tradition developed alongside that of social anthropology, basing its analysis of African culture on essentialist principles derived from the conservative and racially structured African linguistics of Karl Meinhof. It was focused on cultural difference and more resolutely still on tribes. The Ethnological Bureau played a key role in doing masses and masses of historical research that provided the basis for the division of the African population into clearly defined tribes, and in the recognition of certain chiefs over rival claimants, and setting the criteria, the evidence criteria for doing this. Participation in colonial courts and commissions, and later these apartheid-era administrative processes, trained the scions of chiefly and aspirant houses to deliver historical materials in forms needed by the authorities. The net effect was to displace the kinds of dynamic political discourse that were so evident among Africans, whether they were deeply embedded in rural affairs or highly educated Christians, in the first decades of the century, firmly into static tribal tradition and culture, or to marginalize it in increasingly delegitimated resistance politics. These developments underlay what Mahmoud Mamdani describes as the marginalization of Africans from public life, as so many tribes, white citizens in public life, black subjects in tribal life. And we must take note, I think, of Mamdani's point here that this was not particular to South Africa and the apartheid state, though South Africa was a sharply delineated case. It was the condition of many colonies. Now, what I want to draw out from this whistle-stop tour of political discourse in Southern Africa is the argument not only of how this eviscerated the idea of political discourse for the subjects deported into tribal life, replacing it with codified custom and tradition tailored to the new systems, but how this, along with the politics of Zulu nationalism and anthropological searches for African social systems, shaped the production of historical knowledge of the pre-colonial past, not only by scholars, but by their tribal subjects, by tribal subjects, and even the most Christianized, the most urban, the most urbane of these subjects. So, when that generation of historians inspired by Van Sina began to record oral traditions pertinent to the pre-colonial past, they were working in an intellectual framework which disposed them to see certain things. Remember, I was moving them to the side. Certain things as belief, ritual, and culture, rather than politics. They were also working in communities in which understandings of history had been firmly bent into the tribal model, genealogized and molded to administrative concerns. Knowledge of the past was valued, but in a particular form, a form fundamentally shaped by the ideas of tribe and tradition, and significantly denuded of the political potency that someone like Shepstone had attempted to harness. Above all else, it wanted relatively coherent core accounts handed down across the generations, capable of supporting chiefly office and territorial claims. Today, post-apartheid land claim courts recognize oral traditions in precisely this kind of historical evidence format. It's part of the political discourse of the now. So, there's three little stars here, because I'm shifting register. In my talk tonight, I've begun to sketch out something of the epistemic shift in discourse that drew on knowledge of the past and delivered the concept of oral traditions into the 20th century. It's a sketch that both emphasizes contingent turns of history rather than rationally inevitable trends, and a sketch which draws attention to administrative codification and forms of what, and I'm afraid I'm a South Africa victim of the discourse of the now, something that I'm tempted to call academic capture. To understand the implications of the shift in political discourses and what they mean for grappling with the political with the pre-colonial past, I lean a little bit here on Foucault, for whom discourse refers to ways of constituting knowledge together with the social practices, forms of subjectivity and power relations which inhere in such knowledges and relations between them. Discourses, he notes, are more than ways of thinking and producing meaning. They constitute the nature of the body, unconscious and conscious mind, and emotional life of the subjects they seek to govern. So Foucault usefully points us to the continuities and discontinuities between epistemes, those knowledge systems which primarily informed the thinking during certain periods of history, a different one dominating each epistemological age. The continuities and discontinuities between epistemes and the social context in which certain knowledges and practices emerged as permissible, desirable, or where they changed. And my argument tonight has another component where I must lean on Foucault a little. The idea that a distinctive feature of modern power and its disciplinary control is its necessary concern with failures to reach required or normalized standards. Lack. Where oral traditions are concerned, the normalized standard was archive. It was, moreover, a particular concept of archive, the European notion of archive that established archival items as embalmed material, usually documents produced at a particular point in time, ideally the time to which they offer archival testimony, and then preserved to arrive in the present, barely changed. It was, incidentally, an idea of archive quite different from those papal and princely collections of documents of earlier centuries, assembled to justify doctrinal turns and royal claims. It was closer, in fact, to the early records of the mercantile trade. The idea of an unadulterated and stable archive is, in fact, a legacy of 19th century developments of European government archives, as well as perhaps a Rankian approach to history and the export to the European colonies of the resultant notion of archives as immutable and reliable records. In relation to this notion of archive, oral traditions are normalized as less satisfactory testatory forms because they're manifestly affected by the periods between their originary moments and the time of their capture through some form of recording. They fail to reach the normative standard of archive and thus require the kind of specialist methodology of the kind provided by Van Sina, Henniger, and others. So oral traditions were thus positioned, I think, as archives other, as being in libertine circulation, at least until subject to the process of collection, as being protean in the face of archives' frozen form, as prone to degeneration over time, in contrast to the professionally preserved archive. In short, as forensically vulnerable, destined always to be trumped by archive, even when valorized in their own right, even when finally taken out of circulation and stored in the archive. So by now the grounds on which I consider it to be wholly inadequate to focus on questions of whether the contents of oral traditions were invented or not, or even whether they've been manipulated, should be clear. It should be clear that I cannot rest with Van Sina's revised position put forward in his later book, Oral Tradition as History, where he asserted that oral tradition is not just a source about the past, but a historiology of the past, an account of people who have interpreted it. For the researcher who is interested in the past before European colonialism, the challenge is, I think, to get to grips with discourse, discursive change, and the workings of that knowledge-power nexus. Right, so we've sketched out something of the changes that occurred from the 1840s onwards, but what about that concern, the originary concern, the past before colonialism? What discourses and practices existed before colonialism in non-literate situations? In the James Stewart collection, let's get another volume up, we have the notes of the conversations of, say, 200 people. The time of the conversations, remember? 1890s, early 200s, 20s. I've suggested a time of considerable uncertainty and significant shift. We know quite a lot about Stewart and the many people he was talking to. But if we want to probe these notes for indications of past discourses, our first problem is the extent to which the notes reflect what was said. And at the very least, we can be sure the notes are inevitably a partial record. Again, inevitably mediated by Stewart. But what more can we discern? Well, there's a fairly substantial body of scholarship that deals in detail with the respective extents to which these texts were shaped by Stewart and his interlocutors. There's debate on these matters, and that debate's presumably going to be the substance of scholarship for a century or more to come. It's clearly that the notes are totally different from Stewart's own writings on the same topics, and in numerous respects are characterized by the use of concepts and rhetorical forms that were not Stewart's. Stewart's papers include the questions that he prepared. In some places, it's relatively easy to see Stewart guiding the conversation. In other places, it's clear Stewart's recording information that extends well beyond his interests and purposes and even his comprehension. Large swathes of the notes were recorded in isiZulu, much of it seemingly verbatim. Peculiarities of expression, unfamiliar matter, are discussed by Stewart directly with the speakers. In many cases, the notes seem to reflect the particular formulations of the speakers. In some instances, he clearly aims to capture a full flow of a narrative. Some of the topics were obviously introduced by Stewart, others by the speakers. Many of the concepts and rhetorical forms that occur depend for their elucidation on the wider context in the first instance of the full account given by the speaker, but in second instance of the entire corpus. Scholars using this corpus can trace the use of concepts by different speakers across hundreds and hundreds of pages, thereby managing to explore their meaning to an unusually extended degree, well beyond the intentions and usage of individuals. My argument would be that the sheer extensiveness of the archive allows the researcher to probe the lineaments of discourse itself, to discern the kinds of political discourses at work, to follow the mobilization of concepts across multiple occasions, and to gain insight into the ways in which knowledge of the past was being produced in the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. I think there's magnificent research questions here that have profound implications, and they're going to keep hundreds of students busy if the students are excited. I'll come to that in a minute. It's all very well to suggest we can do new kinds of research on these discourses of the late 19th century, but can that help us to think about discursive formations that might have prevailed in earlier times? The further question is whether close exploration of discourses in the 1890s and the forms of the production of historical knowledge at that time, along with possible understandings of political discourses and the production of historical knowledge that occurred in earlier times, let's say Sharkan times, can all of that be used to think about political discourses even earlier? This goes to the issue of at what point further back in time might we begin to theorize and find traces of the possibility of an even earlier epistemic shift. Now, I sort of divine what might be in some of your minds. In raising these questions, aren't I tracking back across that same terrain that's in the classical chain of transmission approach to oral tradition? Someone else might say, aren't you tracking back across the same terrain as archaeologists who use early 20th century ethnographies to try and illuminate early and later Iron Age cultural complexes and the breaks between them? But the argument I'm putting forward is that the subject of my inquiry and my method are wholly different because my framework is that of paying attention to changing ways of constituting knowledge and the relationship of knowledge to power. More specifically, the method neither works forwards through time, one event leading to the other, or backwards, an archival oral tradition attesting to the past. It involves understanding that past events, past discourses that are the objects of inquiry or reference, are perceptible in the present only because of this history across time and because particular knowledge production processes have brought them into view in a particular way. Both materials invoked in contemporary practices, some of them would be oral accounts that reference the remote past, and these documentary sources that researchers might locate in archival folders, are not survivals of past times in the present, but travelers across time that have been embroiled in a situation of epistemic rupture, that have changed shape and accrued new meanings. Such travellers, I argue, were not merely affected by their contexts, but affected them in turn. The remote past that is the object of interest is thus not firmly in a place distinct from the present time of inquiry. Rather, both are folded into each other and into what lies in between, and indeed into the way in which a hoped-for future influences how we handle traces of the past and what we think of as sources in the present. To engage the materials that attest to the past in order to think about the past is to explore this enfoldedness. It requires an approach that tacks backwards and forwards across time, paying attention to the double-storiedness of both events and discourses in the past and traces of them in the present. It's a double-storiedness that involves thinking simultaneously about the story of the making of the trace over time and the making of the story of the past to which the trace refers, also often a matter extended across time and itself involving change. And the quick version is there. It involves understanding how across time archives and oral historical knowledge shape political and public discourses and practices, as well as academic ones, and are in turn shaped by them in a mutually constituting spiral across time. Now, of course, I'm not alone in trying to look across the pre-colonial and colonial divide in these or similar terms. A recent book by Paul Landau on popular politics on the Highveld over the past 400 years is one such study, which has tackled political discourses and forms of political theorizing in similar, but also in interestingly different ways. It is, moreover, a topic of sudden interest to graduate students in a way that I haven't seen before. 3 stars, shifting again. In his introduction to the Paul Knaplund Distinguished Lectures, which John Fage gave in Wisconsin in 1957, Philip Curtin, happens to be one of my own PhD supervisors back in the day, commented that new events constantly bring forth new questions about the past, and that the historian is driven back to the record of the past to bring forth new answers. The events to which Fage's lectures responded was the achievement of independence in Ghana. At the end of 2017, the constitution of knowledge is heavily contested terrain, and a radical call for decoloniality is on the table. A call that in some ways both echoes but also reverberates differently from the decolonial moment in which John Fage lectured. In South Africa, this call takes a strong and assertive form, but its sparks strike tinder everywhere. We've seen it in Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Birmingham, as surely as in that my own incendiary home context. The kinds of knowledge and discourses that have long been hegemonic, deemed permissible and normalized, are being subject to confrontation and disruption. On the one hand, this involves a radical challenge to modes of inquiry that produce human subjects as the objects of knowledge, and more particularly colonized subjects and the descendants of colonized subjects. Disciplines and their archives come under direct scrutiny at exactly the same moment that those other key features of discourse that Foucault identified, the nature of the body, unconscious and conscious mind, and emotional life of subjects, all of this is being critically and actively reviewed. One form of change to the contemporary constraints of discourse is a turn to the vernacular. At a recent conference in South Africa with the title, the Second Pre-Colonial Catalytic Conference, much discussion was focused on a search for, I quote, vernacular concepts, vernacular forms of periodization, and names for historical periods, as well as vernacular historiographies and forms of knowledge. This resulted, in many instances, in a reaching into local languages other than English, but it also bore exploration in English, pushing out the meaning of vernacular beyond strict language references, spoken mother tongue, to encompass a sense of the vernacular as something quite specifically neither schooled nor imposed, but locally made and used. Such concepts, names, and historiographies and forms of knowledge exist today everywhere and are being called on. They also have histories, like the concepts, names, historiographies, and forms of knowledge that they're being used to challenge. Some of these histories are long and deep, rooted in times long before European colonialism. Where contemporary thinkers are interested in the long histories of the vernacular concepts and ideas which they are mobilizing. And of course, not everybody's interested in those long histories, and that constitutes its own problem. But where they are interested, they approach the materials in ways that are somewhat different from the historians of the last century, bent on writing the history of pre-colonial states, trading empires, agricultural systems, or ecological change. Where the latter look for sources and evidence, the former search for those traces of past discourses. The tasks are similar but not the same. It's no accident, of course, that the turns to the vernacular and to discourse draw attention to bodies of words organized in meaningful ways. By beginning to establish an understanding of the kind of discursive formations which existed before colonialism and what happened to them, we begin to be able to grasp more fully the contingency of the current and dominant ways of thinking about what knowledge of the pre-colonial is, what the historical evidence is and is not, what the archives may be or may not be, what oral traditions are and are not. And in so doing, I think new possibilities are hoving quite firmly into view. Thanks for listening.